Hey, Clayton, in Mark 13:30, why did Jesus say, "Truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened"? It seems like he's talking about the end times, and that generation certainly passed away before the end times came. What's going on? Okay, this is a great question. This is one that confuses a whole lot of people. So we're talking about Mark chapter 13 here, and if you look at the heading of this chapter, it says this: the destruction of the temple and signs of the end times. So those headings there, just so you know, were added later. Those are added by English translators who want to kind of break it up and kind of make it easier for people to understand what's going on. So they're not part of the original. And I actually think that this heading might be a little bit misleading in Mark chapter 13, okay? I think part of this is not actually a good description of what's going on in this chapter, okay? So here's why. When you read Mark chapter 13, it is what is called an apocalyptic section, where Jesus is describing in very large, grand imagery a catastrophic thing that's going on. And some of that imagery sure sounds like the end of the world, okay? What we would describe as the end of the world. It's got a part where it says the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from the sky, the heavenly bodies will be shaken. And you say, well, that obviously is the end of the world. And then you get to this verse at the very end of this description of things that you think might be the end of the world. And it says, "Truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until these things have happened." And you say, what is going on? Okay. That Jesus said this in, 33 AD, and 2,000 years later, all of those guys are dead. So what is happening here? Here's where I think the heading misleads us, because we have not read this in context, okay? Look again at the beginning of chapter 13, okay? Chapter 13 starts like this. They are in the temple, right? So this is the last week of Jesus' life. He's been teaching in the temple, and it says in verse 1, as Jesus was leaving the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what massive stones, what magnificent buildings. Look at this beautiful temple. Isn't it awesome?" And then it says this: "Do you see all these great buildings?" Jesus replied. "Not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down." So here's what he's saying. First two verses. Isn't the temple great? Second verse, Jesus is saying it's going to be destroyed. And he was right. In 70 AD, okay, so 40 years from when Jesus is talking, temple is destroyed. So it happens, okay? So what he predicts here happened in 70 AD. Then it says this: as Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, and John, and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when will these things happen?" What things? Okay. When the stone are thrown down, when the temple is destroyed. That's what Jesus was just talking about, right? When will these things happen? And what will be the sign that they are all about to be fulfilled? And then Jesus said to them, and he starts describing all of this stuff. Did you notice what the question was? The question was just about what Jesus had said, the destruction of the temple, which we know happened in 70 AD. It wasn't about something else. There was no mention of the end times. There was no mention of the end of the age. None of this stuff was included. But the people who have read this chapter say, it sounds like it could be the end times, so they just wrote it in the heading, even though that phrase is never used in Mark chapter 13. Now, this confuses people because they say, I thought it was about that, and I think there are some things that are about the end times. Here's why they say that. It's because they have read the version of this that is in Matthew's gospel. So Matthew has this same speech in Matthew chapter 24, but what's interesting is in Matthew chapter 24, it starts with the same way. Jesus leaves the temple. Do you see these things? Truly, I tell you, not one stone will be left on another. And then this is how the disciples frame it up in Matthew's version. "Tell us," they said, "when will this happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age?" So here's what happens. In Mark, the disciples ask the question, "Tell us about when the temple will be destroyed." And Jesus answers that question. In Matthew, it includes the question about when the temple will be destroyed, but it also asks the question, "When will your coming be and the end of the age?" And so Jesus actually answers all of the stuff in Mark chapter 13 in Matthew chapter 24, but then it goes on longer than that, and he answers questions about the end of the age. And so you have one section where it is talking about two things: the stuff that happens in 70 AD when the temple is destroyed, and the stuff that happens at the end of the age. And after the stuff, when it says when the temple will be destroyed, this is when Jesus says, "And truly, I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. So he's talking to people and he's saying, look, some of you guys alive, right? This generation, some of you are going to still be around when this happens. And it's true. In 70 AD, 40 years later, some of those people were around. And so this whole passage, this whole section in Mark chapter 13 is about things that happened in 70 AD. But what about the details that sure sound like it's the end of the world? Okay, what about that verse that I read to you that says, in those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from the sky, the heavenly bodies will be shaken. That sure sounds like the end of the world, doesn't it? And it does. There are some passages in the Bible when it's clearly talking about the end of the world that sound a lot like that. But there are lots of other places in the Old Testament where it sounds different from that. Part of the problem is that we don't know our Old Testament very well. This is often the problem with understanding a lot of Scripture, which is why we encourage you to read the entire Bible, to work your way through so you start to pick up these things. But do you know where this imagery of the sky being darkened and the moon not giving light and stars falling from the heaven, you know where it occurs? It occurs in all sorts of Old Testament passages, prophetic passages, where it talks about the fall of an empire or a city or the temple or something like that. So let me give you a few examples, okay? So in Ezekiel, it's talking about the fall of Egypt. And it talks about, I will cover the heaven, darken the stars, the sun will be covered in a cloud, the moon will not give its light. In Joel, when it's talking about an invading army in Israel, it uses that language. In Amos, it talks about this. When Israel was judged in the earlier era, okay, so this was not something in the future, it was something that we know already happened. In Isaiah, it talks about Babylon being judged, and it says, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light and the stars will fall. It talks about this when the nations will be judged. It says the sky will be dissolved, the heavens rolled up like a scroll, the stars will fall and like withered leaves from the vine. This is talking about things that happened with Babylon falling or Egypt falling or the nations being defeated by Israel, or even times when it talks about Israel, actually the temple being destroyed or Jerusalem falling. And so these things are all kind of stock imagery whenever we say it felt like the world was ending, like my world was ending, our world was ending, the current order of things was falling apart. And so this is a description of what it felt like in 70 AD when the Romans surrounded Jerusalem and they sieged it and they came in and they destroyed the city and they destroyed the temple and they defiled it and people had to scatter all over the place. It was horrible. Now, most of us don't know much about that historic event, but it was a defining moment in the people of Israel's lives, and Jesus was predicting it. And he was using this epic apocalyptic language because it captured just how momentous this was. And so when he talks about the sun being darkened and the moon not giving his light, it doesn't mean the very end of the world. It could just mean the end of our world as we know it right now. And so I actually think that Mark chapter 13 is describing stuff that all happened in 70 AD. The stuff where Jesus is describing things that happened at the end of the age, that's actually contained in the extended portion that's in Matthew 24. Thanks for listening. If you've got your own questions, email questions@BibleSavvy.com. Like and subscribe to catch our regular episodes every Monday on the Bible Savvy Podcast.